Hello and welcome to another adventure in Australian literature. Now, this week's book is one that I was hoping to bring to you at the beginning of the month until I did a little bit of research on it, because the beginning of July was NAIDOC Week, which is the week in which Australia, a week of celebrating the achievements, the resilience, and the culture of our Indigenous people, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And so I was planning on doing this book for NAIDOC Week until I did a little bit of research. And I decided that I didn't necessarily want to do this book for that week. I did still want to talk about this book, and I do still want to talk about the contested nature of identity, but I didn't really want to do that in NAIDOC Week. I felt that that would be a little bit insensitive. So before we get started, remember there is our shop. Please come along. We have books, we have writing services, we have our Redbubble shop with a lot of designs in there that helps to support our channel. Also, like, subscribe, that also helps to support our channel, because we don't do Patreon and we're not monetized for advertising. So if you want to support us, watch videos, share our videos, subscribe, and check out our shop. So what is this book that we are having a look at today? We're having a look at this one, which is called Wildcat Falling, and it is by Mudruru, or as it was originally published, Colin Johnson. Now, this was published in 1965, and this edition still says that this was the first novel published by an Indigenous Australian. The first published Indigenous Australian, I will get back to this, but the first published Indigenous Australian was David Unipon, who published among many things, but among others is known for publishing Dreamtime stories of his people of South Australia and other people. I believe it's just his people of South Australia. He was born in the 1870s. He died in the 1960s at the age of 94. He was an inventor, he was a writer, and he was a preacher. He was also an activist for Aboriginal people throughout the 20th century. David Unipon is familiar to most Australian people as the man on the $50 note. So, before we talk about that, I wanted to put that out there, that the first Australian published Indigenous person was David Unipon. Now, for a long time, until very recently, this book was believed or understood as the first novel published by an Indigenous Australian. Now, this title has been contested, which is why I did not want to do this book for NAIDOC Week. Now, there is the reason why Mudruru's identity as an Indigenous Australian has been contested is, now I am not going to come down and say one way or the other whether he is or whether he wasn't. I think it was in the 90s, one of his family members, in doing research, claimed that he had no Indigenous heritage, doing family genealogy. Now, amateur family genealogy is a very it can be a little haphazard. It can be a little, a little amateur, shall we say. This family member also came from a generation where people didn't like to admit they had convicts in their family heritage, let alone Indigenous people. So can we necessarily throw out this man's Indigenous identity on that? No. Now, Madruru lived his life as an Indigenous, identifying as an Indigenous man. Why is it difficult for people of his generations to fully establish their Indigenous identities? He may have been, he may not have been, but he certainly grew up in, he was schooled in a establishment that also educated Indigenous children. Okay, this is a rarity, especially for Western Australia. You would not find white children and Indigenous children being schooled together. It was a highly segregated world. So he grew up with Indigenous children, with that, with an intimate knowledge, certainly, of their lives, if he was not actually Indigenous. He certainly grew up with an intimate knowledge of the lives of the children of the stolen generations. Now, the stolen generations is the reason why it is so difficult for some Indigenous people or some people of Indigenous descent to establish their Indigenous identity. This is because between 1910 and right up until about 1970, it was government policy, especially in Western Australia. Each state had different policies. The only state that did not have the forced removal of mixed descent children was Tasmania, because Tasmania did not acknowledge the existence of Indigenous Australians after the 19th century, essentially rounding up, putting on an island and letting die out. Oh yeah, this is not pretty. This is going into the nasty side, the possibly one of the most barbaric aspects of colonial and, sadly, 20th century Australian government policy. So between 1910 and about 1970, so for 60 years, so we're not talking one generation, we're talking generations of children, were removed forcibly from parents to be brought up in institutional schools to essentially become a servant class and to breed out their Indigenous heritage. This was absolutely barbaric. It resulted in a loss of culture, a loss of language, a loss of familial connection, a loss of connection to country. It is the kind of thing that, in all honesty, it is just, I don't think you can even give the people who designed this the benefit of the doubt and say that they were doing their best. It is barbaric to think of stripping a person of every aspect of their identity, to take them from their parents, and we know that their parents wanted them the number of stories that are told of Aboriginal men and women attempting to hide their children from the authorities. These were children who were wanted. It was a very deliberate system designed to demoralize Indigenous people, to sever identity for the older generations who were seeing their children taken. They're seeing the future taken away from them. There is no one to pass the songs on to, nobody to pass the stories, the knowledge, the language, nothing. That's going to create enormous despair. So this was, and when I say it was barbaric, it is barbaric. It is a barbaric thing to do, to remove that from a people. So as you can understand, and as you can imagine, establishing an identity as an Indigenous person as part of the stolen generation, re-establishing familial ties, re-establishing connection to country, re-establishing that identity that is taken as a child is difficult, which is why no one has actually said one way or the other, yes or no. It is contested. So there are some people who will say, oh no, we cannot find records to say yes, definitely. However, he did live as an Indigenous person his entire life. So there are two types, two situations wherein there is the Kumari hoax, wherein a non-Indigenous person knowingly and with full understanding of what they were doing usurped Indigenous identity, won prizes and took therefore validation and resources from actual Indigenous writers and was found out. That is completely not on. That's fraudulent. That is adopting an identity that one has absolutely no right to. Madruru fits into the contested, into the he had nothing. In 1965, this was published in 1965. This was published before the referendum in 67 that saw Indigenous rights taken over by the federal government instead of the state government, allowing for a lot of the barbaric practices of the state control to be wiped out and overturned. Because in 1965, although it had improved, you had absolutely no benefit in putting your hand up and saying, I'm an Aboriginal person. People passed as white to avoid, especially not in Western Australia, people passed as white to avoid the control of the board, which controlled your money, it controlled who you married, it took your children. You didn't put your hand up and say, oh yes, I would like this massive government control in my life. So that is why this is a book that is still significant and hasn't just been, oh, that person is a fraud. Because he is writing at a time when there is no material gain to be had for identifying as an Indigenous person. Now, what is this book about? This book is called Wildcat Falling. It is about a young Indigenous man who is part of the stolen generations. He has recently been released from prison, and we follow him around, I think it's Perth, the environs of Perth, where he meets other Indigenous youths who he has been running with, who are on the outskirts, and on the outskirts, generally on the outskirts of any society, regardless of race, generally does involve a level of criminality, generally petty. These people are generally petty criminals. He meets with non-Indigenous people, beatnik, or they're not beatniks, they're bodgies, which is what, like beatniks, but in Australia we call them bodgies in the late 50s, early 60s. So hipsters. He meets with them, isn't comfortable there. He meets university students who are incredibly interested in him, but really cannot hide how patronizing they actually are. And eventually he gets mixed up again in a crime that goes very badly wrong, and a police officer is shot. So in between that, we get a lot of this unnamed young man's life. We see his relationship with his mother here, the effect of being removed from his family, his home. He has a very difficult time connecting with other elder Aboriginal people. So he is a young man falling. That's why he is out of, there is an out of controlness. There is just a falling. It's about identity. It's about establishing yourself. But when there is nothing to support you, how do you establish yourself? That's what is the effect of the stolen generations, is you take away that foundation that allows a person to have an identity. How are you expected? How is he expected to exist in the world when everything that would constitute an identity has been stripped from him? So it is really quite fascinating in that respect, because he is not fully accepted one way or the other with his mixed descent. He cannot sit anywhere. He has been taken out of time, out of place. Now, this book has the original introduction, which was written by Mary Durack of Kings in Grass Castles, about West Australian pastoralists. No, I'm not doing that. I have no interest in reading West Australian pastoralists propaganda, essentially. Because if her essay in the front of this is anything to go back, no, I don't want to read her. No. So Mary Durack was instrumental in getting Madruru published. And as part of the contested identity, it has been suggested that it was Mary Durack who first suggested, or who first put into words, first gave a solid identity as Indigenous. But when you read her introduction, you get it really is an incredible window into attitudes of the time. And although this is a supportive essay, it is supporting this young man in his first novel. The way that she talks about Indigenous people is awful. She manages to pull out all sorts of tropes of the lazy, the dull-witted, these hideous stereotypes that were used by settler society, by the colonial authorities, by the colonist authorities, by the state government to take children, to destroy culture, to destroy this, because it is just the most appalling paternalistic garbage, because they need to be taken care of. And to read that, the one thing it made me think of was a very old book, Orinoco. I think it's Orinoco, which is a book about an African man. And this African man looks very strange because, according to its author, essentially he is, what he looks like is a white person in blackface. And that he is so different from the other African people, who are much the same way that Mary Durack stereotypes and slanders Indigenous people. Slow, you know the drill. So it actually made me think of that, and that's a very old book. That's a book that's like 400 years old. So these racial stereotypes are extraordinarily old. And to see someone in 1965 saying these things, not only saying these things, but using them as, oh, but this one is so different, is really eye-opening. It also explains to quite a degree why it took so long, and why it continues to take so long for Indigenous people to be given full rights, to be fully heard, to be fully recognised. These attitudes they're not attitudes you would hear now, but they have worked worked their way through society enough that they form the bedrock of racist exchanges today. And to see that in the introduction of this book is really quite odd. Not just odd, it is disturbing. It explains why I would say no one in 1965, certainly not in Western Australia, would adopt an Indigenous identity if they did not feel that they had to. This is benign. Hers is benign racism. So, and it's pretty ugly. And so, the overt racism was really terrible. So no one puts themselves in that position to be subject to that. So that is why, again, I say this is a contested identity. It is probably the best piece of understanding what being part of that stolen generations from a first-hand account or first-person narrative feels like, because even with the contested identity, it is very intimately, it has a very intimate understanding of that life experience, which very, very few, I would say, no non-Indigenous person would understand. So that is Wildcat Falling. I would say definitely have a look at it. I would say do have a read of it with the introduction. It does help to illuminate the text. but do remember that there are some very big historical reasons why the author's identity has been in recent years contested. So that's all from me today, and I wish you some great fun in exploring Australian literature. Bye-bye.
If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.